Hello there, Dragonfire here. I am coming at you with another movie review. Alright, this time we're talking about some King Kong and Godzilla movies. Now, I know I did the Monsterverse that started in 2014. A while back, I did a video on that. This one is going to be a little bit different because I am going all the way back to the original Monsterverse. So that series started in 2014 with the release of Godzilla, and it had Kong Skull Island, which was a shared universe thing that was kind of sort of a prequel because it actually takes place before Godzilla. And then it had Godzilla King of Monsters and Godzilla versus Kong. Um, and I know they've come out with a new one now, Godzilla versus Kong New Empire. Um, I thought I am looking forward to seeing that one. I have not seen it yet. New movie came out in the franchise. I think the franchise is okay. It's entertaining enough that I um, would like to see the new second Godzilla versus Kong or fifth movie in that shared universe type deal. Um, but I'm going back to the original. So I am going to 1933 with King Kong. Um, uh, Classic, just all-time classic. This one has King Kong and its sequel, Son of Kong, on the same uh, DVD set here. Oh, actually, it's just a single DVD. Fit both movies on a single DVD. Um, this one is an all-time classic. King Kong came out in 1933. Um, it is an all-time classic. It uh, they There's a filmmaker. He wants to go to um, this island that he purchased a map from some guy. Found out about this great creature that lives on this island. So I guess he wants to like shoot some footage of the creature itself, and then he wants to work around that. Maybe get some footage of the natives who live on the island. Get some footage of the of his actors doing different scenes, and then kind of put it all together and hopefully make a movie out of it. Kind of using uh, documentary footage along with actors and film footage. So kind of ahead of its time to like mix those two things together. Um, is this fictional director in this movie saying that he's going to make a film out of this when he gets um, all that stuff. Very good. Everything was done with claymation. Kong lives on Skull Island. He lives amongst these. He lives on this island where these other creatures also live, and um, uh, he um, in the movie, like he fights like a T-Rex. He fights like a Stegosaurus. There's a Brontosaurus at one time. There's also giant, almost like insect-like creatures and whatever else there is in this movie. Uh, yeah, it's pretty good claymation. I think it still holds up. That it looks as good as it does is just amazing. I love the practical special effects, the claymation. Yeah, I love this movie. They capture him Of course, bring him back to America, bring him back to the United States, and he gets loose. Once he does, he climbs up the Empire State Building. They tried to put him on display as some sort of spectacle, um, and of course, eventually he falls off and dies. Kong has a weird relationship. You can see some of the album or some of the movie art that was created for these two films. Um, this one being for the first King Kong, and this one over here for its sequel, Son of Kong. But um, uh, um, just an iconic thing. And this is a bit of a spoiler, but just go watch the movie. It's still very good. Kong does die at the end of the first movie, and so with the second movie, that when they go back to the island, they find out that Kong wasn't alone, that he had a son who I guess was orphaned when they shipped his dad off to New York. But um, uh, and so you get Son of Kong. Um, good. Uh, just the first one in particular is a great movie. The second one I don't know is remembered as well. Interestingly enough, both movies did come out in 1933. Um, let's see here, I'm trying to pull it up. Yes, one that came out March 2nd, 1933. The other one came out December 22nd, 1933. So they both came out in the same calendar year in 33. Um, Son of Kong has got to be one of the earliest examples of, if not the very first example, one of the earliest examples of a cash grab sequel. Rushed into production, rushed finished the film because of the success of the original. The original was held up very, very well. It was released in back into theaters. You got to remember, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and so on. They didn't have home video. There was no such thing as home video. No DVDs or VHSs or any of the later formats like Laserdisc that you would later get home video. And of course, nowadays we have streaming. Most people didn't even own TVs really until starting in the 1950s. By the end of the decade, TVs were pretty popular. By the 1960s, even more so in the 1960s and stuff. Probably almost every household in America had one by the end of the 60s, but 50s and 60s was still kind of an emerging age for television. So even if these things played on television, they wouldn't be playing on television until the 1950s, probably at the earliest. Or if they were, then very few people even owned televisions prior to that. Um, people weren't watching at home. There was no internet. There was no streaming. But they every few years, number of years, they would re-release King Kong. Son of Kong is a shorter movie. It's not short enough, I think, to be considered a short. It's still considered feature length, but definitely shorter than the original. And I think sometimes they would play the two together as a double feature, just to try to get their money's worth out of Son of Kong. Um, but it was definitely the weaker of the two films. Returning to the island, seeing King Kong's son. And another spoiler, I guess, here that's important to what I'm going to talk about, but in Son of Kong, at the very end of the movie, uh, Skull Island does end up sinking into the ocean, and Son of Kong, dies just like his father died in the first movie. Um, so we definitely have different versions of King Kong going forward in the series. Um, like I said, all of Skull Island sinks into the ocean at the end of Son of Kong. So, um, yes, but there were prehistoric creatures living on the island. Yet Kong was still king. He fights a T-Rex. You get an early version, if you will, of what essentially is like a King Kong versus Godzilla matchup before Godzilla was even invented. Um, but yeah, um, great um, things. I think in these movies is 1933. The general population doesn't know probably very much about dinosaurs, but all the dinosaurs in the movies are depicted as carnivores, even ones that are believed, nowadays to be herbivores. They're depicted as carnivores, so they're a menace, and they're like trying to eat the human characters, like a brontosaurus trying to, yeah, eat some people and stuff like that. So, um, uh, yeah, but I think King Kong is a classic. Son of Kong, maybe not as much, but it's actually a fine movie for it is for what it is. I don't want to spoil the plots anymore of these, but if you go through them, I would say these are worth watching at least once each. Classic. I think the story of King Kong holds up really well because they essentially, although it's been years since I've seen them, I've seen both of the remakes, early remakes, where they basically stuck very close to the story of the first movie, but just did it in updating it each time for a more modern audience. So, I believe the first time King Kong got remade was um, in '76. They made a movie called King Kong, and it was essentially just a remake of that. And then I believe the one that came out in '86 called King Kong Lives was a sequel to that '76 remake 10 years later. And then in 2005, um, they came out. So there were no King Kong movies in the '80s, but in 2000, or sorry, in the '90s, I meant to say there was the '86 one, which was a sequel to the '76 one, um, but none in the '90s. But in 2005, they came out with another version of King Kong, which I believe I've seen before, and I think is essentially the same story as the '33 one. So they've done the movie three times. The movie has been made three different times, um, with essentially the same story each time. And that just tells you like how good and like how kind of a good story it was and how well it's set up and everything, for it to be remade all the times it's been remade. Um, the story still holds up, and then it was in 2017, uh, Kong Skull Island came out, and they brought King Kong into the Monsterverse that had been started in 2014. So that covers the 1930s. You have Kong, you have Son of Kong in this kind of original run, if you will. And in now, no movies of that kind of nature were made in the 1940s, but then you come to the 1950s, and in the wake of World War II, you have Godzilla. So, um, Godzilla is um, was a very interesting film of time. It's during a period of time where Japan is is recovering from World War II after the United States dropped the nuclear bomb on them, dropped two nuclear bombs on two large cities in Japan. And um, uh, this kind of Godzilla is kind of a metaphor in some ways for the nuclear bomb. Um, there's a lot of political kind of commentary going on that's very interesting. It actually is a film that you could take it and you could kind of see from different sides. Um, it's not anti-American like you might think that a film made in Japan that was essentially kind of metaphorical for the nuclear bomb in some ways. Um, so in the film, they're doing some nuclear testing outside of outside of Japan in the ocean. They're doing nuclear testing, and this basically the film doesn't really explain how it happens. And I'll talk about the American version in a little bit, but right now I want to talk about the original Japanese version from uh, what did I say? 54. The original Japanese version comes out in 54. And um, and I did watch the original Japanese version in Japanese with English subtitles. Um, so it's not really clearly explained in the movie, but for some reason, somehow, um, the nuclear testing either it somehow brings this creature out and um, has him emerge from the water. And so, like, it's this thing where I don't know if there was a dormant egg down there, and the nuclear thing causes Godzilla to hatch from the egg. I don't know if he was just living down there as an amphibious creature, just content to live underwater, or what exactly is Godzilla supposed to uh, happen. But for whatever reason, it's the nuclear testing that brings Godzilla to the surface. And it starts out with destroying some ships. Um, there's a lot of devastation in this movie. And this movie very much plays to the human suffering and showing what happens to the people of Japan and the suffering. And and one thing that kind of struck me about this was, people, um, particularly, us here in America, we might like look at like Japanese people from around that time period, and or might be tempted to think of them as relatively primitive. But I think when you watch this movie, it's not like a stereotype of like Japanese, where you see a lot of Japanese films, maybe in America, maybe even some Japanese films, like if all you've ever seen is like kung fu films and martial arts films, um, and everybody wears gis um, or komodos or stuff like that. Um, you can see in this film that people are dressed very modern. You don't really see them dressed any differently than um, than the way people would be dressed in an American movie from the 1950s. The men are wearing suit and ties, the women are wearing dresses. Um, I just think that it's not some sort of just stereotypical. It's actually showing that Japanese culture was quite modern at the time, the 1950s, post World War II, and I think it's very humanizing. You don't see them as like just primitive savages like you do the natives of Skull Island, for instance, in King Kong and Son of Kong. The natives of Skull Island are very much like primitive peoples that don't have modern technology and whatnot. But with um, the original Godzilla, you do get to see some scene like um, in like smaller villages in Japan where they don't have as much technology, but then you also get to see the big city where um, where it looks like any American city, and um, is so I just found that interesting because I think that probably any solely made American film that would feature um, a lot of Asians probably at this time probably would have had like this more stereotypical view of of like the old timey um, Asians still like following very much like ancient Asian traditions in the modern day. Whereas when you see people who actually live in Japan, they're quite modern. A lot of them, a lot of them extremely modern for the time. And so I found that aspect interesting. And this film does focus on the human characters a lot. And these Japanese people picks out a few individual characters like any film, and you follow the human drama. And it shows their suffering when Godzilla comes through, and that of course is a metaphor for the crazy stuff that the nuclear bomb did. They have scenes that they talk about after Godzilla raids a village and they go in with the equipment to detect radiation. Yes, Godzilla is like he's like a radioactive mutant or something because like he leaves it, this indicates that he's not just a normal creature but he probably has mutated because of the um, radiation and the nuclear testing and all that. So he's leaving radiation behind and he's poisoning water. And now people don't in these villages and stuff don't even have clean water to drink after they were devastated by the attack. So it's really interesting, really good storytelling of the consequences. But like I said, I don't feel like the film is anti-American. I was just saying like that the dropping of the nuclear bomb was the worst thing ever that happened. Like the film, if anything, I feel like shows like consequences to actions. Because um, uh, in the film, as Godzilla is doing these attacks and whatnot, they have to find a way to stop him. And so there's very much a parallel. Like there's this scientist who has invented this thing um, that in in it in their own way, this Japanese scientist has invented his kind of own version of it, like a nuclear bomb. But instead of a nuclear bomb, which they speculate or they believe this thing that even brought Godzilla in the first place, and would actually seemingly only make him stronger, so you can't just nuke Godzilla and get rid of him. Um, but um, uh, okay, where was I before the telephone call? so uh, it, there's a thing here where the scientist invents this uh, device that is almost in its own way kind of like this nuclear bomb. Um, and it is um, what it does is it removes oxygen from water, and somehow that like um, kills everything in the water basically. Um, it's weird because if you actually removed oxygen from water, it wouldn't be water anymore. It would just separate into hydrogen atoms. But anyway, um, it's essentially this thing that kills everything within a certain radius. And um, they make, he uses one earlier in the film to kill like a fish tank full of fish, and they turn to bones almost immediately. And so at the end of the film, that is the resolution, how they end up stopping Godzilla with this bomb um, that they set off underwater, and then Godzilla turns to bone. So he is definitely dead at the end of the movie. Um, they um, uh, do this. I wanted to talk about a different part of this as well, and that is the drama of like whether or not to use it, whether or not to use the thing. At first, the scientist who creates it doesn't want to use it, but then he feels like he's forced to, like he has to use it because of all the destruction that Godzilla is causing, and it's the only way to stop Godzilla. They've tried electrocuting Godzilla, they've tried their armies, they shot at him with tanks and machine guns and all sorts of whatever weapons that the Japanese people had at the time, and they just can't stop Godzilla. He just goes through and leaves a path of destruction in his wake. And um and so it's something where they try to stop Godzilla and they can't, so they use the bomb as the last resort. It kind of This is where I say that the film is not anti-American, because it's kind of, it almost like just how like they feel justified in using this weapon that could potentially cause like mass destruction, and the scientist who invents it doesn't want it to get out to the point where he like burns like the all his research so that no one will be able to use it afterwards. And he even essentially like uh kind of dies on purpose from the very thing that destroyed Godzilla also destroyed him. Um, he kind of, it's kind of a suicide, um, by kind of letting himself be destroyed in the same way Godzilla himself is destroyed. Um, uh, in all this, but he very much wants to make sure that no one can follow in his footsteps, that they can never build another one of these things after he dies, after Godzilla is dead. And so uh, they um, they they do all this stuff. The scientist guy who invents this thing does this to stop Godzilla, but he doesn't want it to be used again, because this thing, you could drop it into some water and destroy all the wildlife and so forth. You could take away an area, like, you could devastate people who depend on the ocean for fishing and food and so forth. Um, so it's like this weapon of mass destruction. He doesn't want it to be used again, but he feels justified in using it against Godzilla because of the destruction that Godzilla has caused. So, one way perhaps this movie could be interpreted is actually that it kind of sympathizes with America dropping the bomb on Japan because uh, it essentially ends the war against Japan. And of course, Japan bombed America, part of America, the state of Hawaii. Um, they bombed Pearl Harbor and all that, and and they attacked. Of course, we were helping the other side, and they attacked us to stop us from helping the other side. And then we felt justified in helping the other side. They felt justified in attacking us, and then we kind of felt justified in dropping the bomb on them to get them to surrender and to stop the war. Um, and um, to stop World War II and everything that went on there. So it is, it's a complicated political situation. It's not cut and dry one way or the other. Uh, Obviously, Japan was, not um, doing some very good things during World War II. And so, um, a lot of people argue about whether or not America was justified to drop the atom bomb. Um, and it's a matter of perspective, but this movie almost kind of gives like a pro-American side of kind of like because they use a weapon very very similar in the way that it could destroy things in order to stop what Godzilla is doing. Um, and it's the only way they see to stop him. But there's all this stuff about letting the genie out of the bottle, and it's very similar. Like the debate over this device that they think can kill Godzilla and eventually ends up killing Godzilla and that succeeds is much like the debate in the movie is much like the debate in real life over atom bombs and H bombs and nuclear weapons and nuclear all kind of stuff and what it does, nuclear power and how you get rid of the toxic waste that's left behind and everything like that is touched on in this movie of like how you're gonna do it, Um, and so the debate over nuclear power, the debate over nuclear um, contamination, the debate over whether or not we should have or shouldn't have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the destruction that came, real people being hurt. Um, it's very much commentary on that. Doesn't necessarily give you all the answers. It lets you decide for yourself, but it explores it in a very metaphorical way. Um, so a couple of years later, because I think we said yeah. So the film is released in Japan in '54. A couple of years later, in '56, we get the film being released in America. It's an edited version. So they took the original Japanese version as it was released in Japan. They edited it and they shot more scenes in presumably in America with American actors. Um, uh, so they intercut this story where basically there's this news reporter from Chicago. He works for like one of the major newspapers and he was on a trip. I think he was actually planning on going to Thailand or something like that. And he stops in Japan on the way there, or maybe some other country. Maybe he's going to Australia, whatever it is. And um, he has like a layover in Japan on the way there. And then I think his plane might have to do an emergency landing. So he gets, and then no planes are leaving afterwards. So he gets stuck in Japan. And so they have this American guy and they intercut um, scenes that were shot for the American version with the original scenes from the Japanese version, and they intercut the two. Sometimes they overdub the original um, Japanese actors actually speaking in Japanese with the um, Japanese actors speaking English, and it is somewhat believable that probably some of the people in Japan, especially like successful businessmen or whatever, knew some English. And there are scenes sometimes where some of the characters don't know English, so he has to have like a companion with him who's translating, so that like the Japanese guy who knows both English and Japanese translates for the American guy who only knows English. Um, and so and they actually I think do a really good job of intercutting the original film and stuff that was probably shot a couple years later than the original film was shot. It comes out 2 years after the original film comes out. They slice the two together, so it's somewhat believable that he's actually in Japan when the events are taking place. So it's almost like, and when it was released in America, they changed the title to, instead of just Godzilla or the Japanese equivalent of that, I think in Japanese it's actually pronounced Giz, Godzilla, or I don't know how it's pronounced. Godzilla? Something like that. But we always pronounce it Godzilla in English, but anyway, G- Jigaya, Jigora. Jigora, that's how it's pronounced, I believe, in Japanese. Jigora, I was reading back here. Jigora, or Godzilla. We say Godzilla in English. Um, but anyway, they intercut the two movies together, and whenever they have to have like one of the Japanese characters interacting with this new American character, they'll like shoot the Japanese character from the back of the head, so you see that they're like shooting the scene from like behind the Japanese character, so all you can see is the back of the Japanese head's character, and then you see the American guy's face. So it's like you're seeing it from a weird camera angle that you don't normally see in most movies. Um, uh, and uh, So they did a good job of matching like back of head so that you could believe that, oh, that's the actual back of the head of that one character who's in the original film, or and they they matched the clothes that they were wearing, so it looks like it actually does look like the original character is standing in front of the other character, so you can see both characters in the same frame at the same time. Other times they intercut frames where they show um, the American in one shot, and then the next shot they show the Japanese, but it's done in such a way that you can kind of believe that they're still standing in the same room together. It's just cutting back and forth between the two different people. Um, and yeah, and I think it's actually pretty well done. They cut out parts of the Japanese film in order to fit more time with the American character, but you could almost like believe that it's the same film from two different points of view. One point of view, you only see, the Japanese characters and what's going on with them and what they're doing and how they're going against Godzilla and all this kind of stuff. And in the other film, you get to see the same events unfold, but you get to see it from unfold from the perspective, mostly shot from the perspective of this American character, and he sees that he's there visiting Japan. He sees the havoc that is wreaked on the people, and he sees everything that's going on, and um, so I think that the it's a really good film. The Japanese version and the American version. If you don't like reading subtitles, then the American version is easier to digest for the English speaking audience. I'm going to show off some of this stuff here. Um, yeah, so awesome. Godzilla definitely a inspiration for the Dragonfire persona. Um, yes, very nice Blu-ray release. It's got tons of liner notes and great stuff here. Um, really recommend this movie if you haven't seen it. Just good stuff. Uh, and uh, followed that up. Now, let's see. So, yes, the original Japanese version of Godzilla comes out in 54. In 55, so this is still before the Americanized version, which was called Godzilla King of the Monsters, comes out in in 56. But in 55, um, Japan releases the sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, and um, and this one I also watched both um, the original Japanese version, and then later the American version. The um, so it does say here, this is interesting. I'm reading on the back here. It gives the runtime. It says that the Japanese version is 81 minutes and 34 seconds, whereas the English version clocks in at even 79 minutes. So it looks like uh, about a little over 2.5 minutes are cut out of the English version. I did not realize that when I was watching both versions. So the English version is just dubbed out with subtitles and probably came out in America about the year after Godzilla King of the Monsters came out. They didn't change the title of it. It was still Godzilla Raids Again, which is what the Japanese title is, it translated into English. Um, okay, well it says here. Okay, it looks like Japanese version 55, American version 59. So so we have um, original Godzilla coming out in 54, then Godzilla Raids Again in 55, both of them coming out in Japan. In 56, we got Godzilla King of the Monsters here in America, and then Godzilla Raids Again in 59. This one, you do get to see um, a Galosaurus, I believe is what they call him. Uh, and he gets to fight Godzilla. Um, Now, obviously, the original Godzilla from the first movie died, like I already talked about. Um, Augulus, I guess is what they call him. Um, Even though everyone is aware that the original Godzilla dies, in the Japanese version, they just, as soon as this new one shows up, they just start calling him start calling him Godzilla or Jigora. Um, and um, for whatever reason. Now, okay, so I should talk about that. The name Godzilla in King Kong, I think they pick up the name King Kong from the Islanders, what the Islanders refer to him as. The natives of that island where they first discover King Kong and Skull Island, similarly, that's kind of what happens here with Godzilla, and that Godzilla, um, uh, there's an ancient legend among some of the uh, Japanese islands. One in particular has a legend of this great creature called Godzilla. And so when he comes, they say, well, it must be that ancient creature, so that people start calling him Godzilla. In the sequel, there's really no explanation as to why they refer to this creature as Godzilla, except for that he's just identical to the other one, even though it sounds like a proper name. Maybe Godzilla isn't a proper name. Maybe Godzilla is a species name that they just assigned to every creature that looks like that. Because obviously the original Godzilla died, and this has to be another individual of the same species, and they call it Godzilla. Um, in the first movie, they say that Godzilla is a dinosaur who lived 2 million years ago, um, and that he was the transitional state between uh, land dinosaurs and sea dwelling dinosaurs. So I guess that would make him like an amphibian, um, or or do they say part of that? I forget what all they explained in the first one and the second one. I know the first one they say Godzilla is 2 million years old, or that he was a creature who existed 2 million years ago. That there were other creatures that were basically identical. These Godzilla creatures existed 2 million years ago. In and then in the second movie when he fights Agulus or Agosaurus or whatever it is they call him. Um, they say in the second movie, the first movie, they say Godzilla is 2 million years old. I think they say this creature in the second movie is 150 million years old or 120. It's either 120 or 150, something like that. So I don't know how much he's older. And then they talk about them being natural enemies. So maybe they kind of lost continuity with the first movie. But um, yeah, yeah, that's true. They're too far apart in the timeline to be natural enemies. But um, in the English, uh, I think in the English version, instead of referring to the second creature as Godzilla, if I'm remembering correctly, I think in the English version, because the original Godzilla died, I think they just keep referring to him as Gigantus. Um, if I, or is that in the Japanese version? No, I'm forgetting. Um, yeah, just following along the subtitles in the Japanese version, and then you have the English dub over in the English version. But um, I think it's the English version where they, instead of calling him Godzilla, now they just call him Gigantus, because I guess Godzilla was the first one that died. You can definitely tell they're just reusing the same rubber suit, and that this is the identical creature who attacked, or it's identical to the creature who attacked him, even though the creature was obviously dead, unless Godzilla somehow regenerated. Um, you know, but Godzilla, of course, does the breathing fire thing from the very first movie. I forgot to mention that. I don't think that was natural ability of the creature. The breathing fire thing comes as a result of his exposure to radiation. Now he can kind of breathe the radiation and catch things on fire. Um, so he can spit fire. So he kind of crosses like the ancient, like medieval legends of a dragon with those of dinosaur, and they do refer to him, I think, in both the first and second movie Godzilla as being a dinosaur. Okay, um, and Godzilla at the end of part two. I know this is a spoiler, but It's somewhat relevant to the next movie. So Godzilla ends up getting trapped in ice, like it's trapped in ice, and that's stopped. They can't kill him the same way that they did in the first movie because no one has been able to recreate the research of the thing. So the research that that one scientist did after he died, so they have to find a different way to stop him, and they wait till he's on this big island in the middle of nowhere, and then they cover him. They have like mountains avalanche on him, and he's trapped in the ice or whatever. The whole movie, by the way, takes place in the wintertime in Japan. So there's lots of snow everywhere, but just makes you kind of wonder what happens when the ice melts. And they may have already been thinking of doing more and more of these movies, so maybe they were setting that up for later on the ice would melt and anything. But they ended up not doing any more movies for the rest of the 1950s in Japan or in America. Both movies were released in Japan, both movies released in America, but they didn't do anything else for the rest of the decade. But in the 1960s, I believe it's 1962, they come back with King Kong versus Godzilla, or six, yes, 62. So um, this is a big crossover event. You have the great movie monster from America, King Kong, the great Japanese movie monster, Godzilla, and so these both gigantic creatures. Now, I believe in the really, if you think about it, Godzilla's got to be much bigger than King Kong because Godzilla in the first couple of movies, it seems like he walks among really tall buildings and is the same height as these super tall buildings. Um, and then with uh, but then again, how tall are the tallest buildings in Japan at the time? I don't know. But King Kong in his movie climbed the Empire State Building, so you got to have a much larger creature instead of a creature that climbs building, a creature that is as tall as the tallest buildings. But anyway, um, uh, yeah, it was just this natural thing of let's just put these two guys in suits, one guy in a Godzilla suit, one guy in a King Kong suit, and just have them fight each other. Um, and one of the first, not the first crossover movie, because the Universal Monsters had done that, had done crossovers, like the Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, uh, the Invisible Man, all that kind of stuff. They had done some crossover stuff with the Universal Monster movies, probably starting in the 40s or 50s, but um, and the first of those movies also coming out in the 30s, but this was a big crossover movie for these two giant monsters. That I think most of the movie was shot in Japan. It was kind of a joint effort. They did some stuff in America and some stuff in Japan. Most of the movie is shot in Japan and has Japanese actors, but they throw a few American actors in there, like on TV that are kind of watching the events unfold. And, they have like a news broadcast thing going on, and it's like back and forth, and so like everyone around the world is watching what's happening in Japan with these two big monsters fighting each other. Um, this movie's entertaining enough for what it is. I know there's always been a rumor that there was an alternate ending, um, it, um, where Godzilla won instead of King Kong. I guess that's a spoiler, but at the end of the movie, King Kong does kind of show him swimming back to his home island, which they changed the name of the island on this one. And some may say, well, if Skull Island sink at the end of Son of Kong, then this King Kong type creature would have to come from a different island. But in reality, um, this is a completely different thing. If you watch this movie, it is not a sequel to the other movies. It's clear that the previous attacks did not happen and that this is the first time they're ever seeing this creature. In this uh, movie again, they give a different age for how old Godzilla is or how old his species is. They say that he's a cross between a Tyrannosaurus Rex and a Stegosaurus. Then that's why he has the um, big spikes thingies on his back, because I guess that's the Stegosaurus part. And they give it, different age of how many millions of years ago he was supposed to have lived. King Kong grew to be a giant ape because he ate some berries that made him grow giant. Um, King Kong is strengthened by electricity in this one. And even though no one has ever seen either of these two monsters before, and all the previous attacks that the movies didn't happen in this universe, they still, as soon as the monsters show up, even though no one's ever seen them before, they instantly name them Godzilla and King Kong. So, I don't know. It's just like they show up and it's like, oh, it's Godzilla. It's like, what? How did do what? What? They give no explanation in the other movies. They give explanations of where the name came from, but in Godzilla versus King Kong, it's just all of a sudden people, even though they've never seen anything like it before, just say, "Oh, that's King Kong," and "Oh, that's Godzilla." That they just name the creatures. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Um, but uh, yeah. This is fun for what it is. This is a big old fight. The fight scenes are the best scenes in the movie. Big old fight scenes. So, um, so that's my reviews. I've gone for an hour, I guess now. Great kind of original set of films here with King Kong and Son of Kong both coming out in 33. You got the Japanese version, I said 54, right? Uh, Godzilla 55 with Godzilla Raids Again. Then it comes out the English version, Godzilla King of the Monsters, and 56, I believe, and then 59 for its sequel, Godzilla Raids Again, um, and 62 for Godzilla versus King Kong. You know, definitely, um, I'm gonna go and say that the best of these five movies is maybe the original Godzilla, um, in the original Japanese version. I understand not everyone wants to read subtitles. You can watch the American version. Just know that there's some extra context left out and also extra things added in. Um, yeah, great series of movies. King Kong is classic. Godzilla is a classic. Seeing them fight each other is fun. Some of the stuff to get there in King Kong versus Godzilla isn't always as fun. It's kind of whatever, whatever. King Kong versus Godzilla is also a bit of a science fiction movie. It definitely it does not have just the technology of the day, but it imagines like a more technologically advanced, like I don't know if it's supposed to be taking place in the future or if it's supposed to take place in an alternate universe, but some of the technology that they utilize in the movie isn't technology that would have actually been available in 1962, um, or some things that haven't even been invented in real life at all. But there you go. That's my review of these movies. Uh, just good stuff, enjoyable stuff. So give the Godzilla original series a try. All right. God bless everybody. Dragonfire out.